Hi everyone, I'm Rebecca Rhodes. Today I'd like to demonstrate how to paint the eye of this deer in watercolor. And we only need 3 colors. Let's get started.
I've got Burnt Umber, Ultramarine Blue, and a small puddle of Winsor Lemon. And those are the only colors that we'll need for this eye. First, I'll create a gray mix by combining Ultramarine Blue and Burnt Umber. I'll pick up some of this Burnt Umber and bring it up here. Right now, both of these puddles are the consistency of cream. I'll pull some blue lower and bring some brown into the blue. There's a little more blue in the mix than brown. Let's see how this looks. I'm aiming for a neutral gray. And this is looking good. It's not too blue or too brown. Add a little bit of water to create the consistency of thin milk. My brush is clean and just barely damp. And I'll pick up a little bit of color on the tip of the brush. You don't need a lot of color on the brush because we're creating pretty thin lines and small shapes. First, I'll create a map of the prominent lines and shapes in and around the eye, and this will serve as a guide as we move in with color. This is a pale application, and the idea is to create a map or a guide that we can use to keep track of where all these important lines and shapes are. It will help me to keep from getting lost. And I'm using the very tip of the brush to go around the edge of the iris. I've got 2 versions of the photo in front of me. The original and one in which the brightness has been adjusted so that I can better see these lines and shapes. I rinse the brush often and wipe it on the towel before picking up new color. That way the color won't clump on the brush. And I find that as the gray begins to dry, it tends to separate. All you need to do is just go back in and remix it again. I'll lay in where the pupil will be. In the photo, this eye is very dark, and it's difficult to see where all of the features are. So I looked up other photos to use as a guide where I wasn't quite sure what to do. I'll lightly go over this shape, but not too dark. This is going to be the eyelashes, so I'll leave that for now. This shape will eventually be a very dark brown, so I'll lay in some gray to get that started. And there it is. We've created a map of the lines and shapes in and a little bit around the eyes, and that will serve as a guide as we apply further layers of color. And we'll be able to keep track of where that pupil is. And these darker shapes will eventually become either black or a very dark brown. This dries quickly because the applications are so thin, and we can move right into the first layer of color. Eventually, this eye will contain all kinds of browns and black. And to get started with the brown, I'll use this Winsor Lemon. I'm adding a tiny bit of water, creating the consistency of whole milk. Do you see how I'm turning the brush to cover all sides? This is going in anywhere that will be brown or black, and I'll work around this shape up here, which is the highlight. This yellow will enhance the browns to come. And I'd like it to be a pretty intense yellow. When that's completely dry, we'll move to the next layer of color. And this is ready to go. I'm adding water to this burnt umber, creating up here a very thin consistency. This is like tea. And down here, we'll leave it a little thicker. So I'll begin with a pale application of burnt umber, and I'll fill the brush with color. This will go anywhere that will eventually be black or brown. And I'm still working around that highlight shape. And you see how pale this is? That yellow shines through. This is going to represent the lightest brown that I can see. And I think I'll pull some pale burnt umber right into there. And also up here. Do you see how pale that is? And down here. And I like how it looks when placed over that previous yellow. We've got the first layer of brown in place, and that represents the lightest value in this eye, which is over here. So on this side, we need to lay in a darker value of brown. Typically, I lay in the color wet on dry, but you could also do this wet in wet. I'll begin with this consistency of tea, and then I'll move to this thicker consistency. So the idea right now is to simply dampen the area, and I'm doing that by laying in this very thin application. Lay it right over the pupil. I tend to use wet on dry because I can control exactly where the color goes. Now I'll touch it in over here, but really I'd like to keep that area lighter in value. Now while the eye is damp, I'll pick up some of the color here that's beginning to dry, so it's thicker. This is like whole milk to thin cream. And while this is damp, you can touch in the color and lift it and watch how it spreads. And it won't spread too far because the eye is just damp. So I'll take it all over the pupil, and eventually the pupil is going to be a black, maybe a very dark brown. Now coming towards this area, I'm using a touching motion, watching how the color spreads, and I'll take it to about there. And now I'll rinse the brush, and my brush is just barely damp. And I'll thin it out so we have a smooth transition from the darker brown into the lighter area. And I just picked up a tiny bit more color, and I'm touching in just a bit. And right along the edge, I'll use a touching motion. Now I don't want to play with that too much, so when it's dry, I'll make further adjustments. Now that this is dried, I can see where refinements need to be made before moving to the next step. And what I'm seeing is it is lighter in value here, but I'm seeing a pretty abrupt line right there. And I'd like to see a smoother transition from dark to light. So what I'll do is take my slightly damp brush and just touch that area. I have a paper towel in my other hand. Now the brush is barely damp. Touch it with the paper towel, and you can move some color around and create a smoother transition. And it doesn't need to be perfect right now because there are more layers of color coming. Okay. Now that will go darker, but next I feel like I need to reinforce what will be the darkest parts so I can keep track of where they are. And I'm specifically thinking about this shape, which will be a very dark brown, and this shape, which is the pupil. I'll return to the gray on the palette, and do you see how when it dries, it appears blue? But all you need to do is mix it up with your damp brush, and the gray will reappear. Now up here, I'm creating more of a bluish gray, just in case I need that color. Let's see how it looks. Yeah, that gray contains just a little more blue in the mix. And down here is that neutral gray, not too blue or too brown. We've got a lot of layers of brown in place already in this eye, so I'll use this gray that's got just a little more blue in the mix. This is like thin milk. If I find that it's not quite dark enough, I'll go in with more like whole milk to thin cream. And what I'd like to do is reinforce where it's going to be darker. And that gray on the palette is creating a very dark brown on the paper. I'm using a touching motion to ensure that the previous layers of color will stay in place as I apply this darker value. I think I'll take this gray right around the lower edge of the eye. And a very thin application right around there. We can see where the darkest shapes are, the lightest area, and we've got a lighter brown. And right now things are appearing pretty disjointed, and I'd like to see a smoother transition from the very dark shapes into this lighter area. So I need to reinforce the mid-tone browns, those that are not quite as dark as this and this. I'll return to the gray on the palette. I'll need to remix some brown and ultramarine blue. Up here, I'll keep it more bluish. Down here, it's more of a neutral gray. And we'll need a thinner consistency. So if I had used whole milk for those very dark shapes, I'll use more like thin milk now. I'll begin with this neutral gray. The goal is to create a smooth transition from the very dark into that lighter area. And because we've got a lot of layers of color underneath, I'll use a gentle touching motion with the tip of the brush. I'm kind of creating dots of color. You can take it right into the pupil. And this is not quite as dark as the previous application. It's a thinner consistency. So I'll take it to about there. When you take your time and just touch in the color, the previous layers will stay in place. Now, moving this way, I'll begin to use a gray that contains more brown. And you might need to do some experimenting until you find a color that you like. Now here I'm just touching the edge to thin it out. Now back to the palette, I'll use some brown that contains just a tiny bit of ultramarine blue. So this is a different kind of brown, and little by little I want to just bring the color closer to that area that's the lightest. I keep rinsing my brush and wiping it on the towel, and I'm touching the edge of the color to create a smooth transition from very dark to mid-tone to lighter brown. When that's dry, we'll decide if we need to make further refinements. Next, I'd like to give attention to this highlight shape. Often, you see a reflection of the sky in that shape, and I'll lay that in now. Here's a small puddle of ultramarine blue. And I'll need some different consistencies. I'll add some water down here, creating the consistency of tea, and I'll leave it thicker up there. That's more like whole milk to thin cream. And I'll begin with the consistency of tea. Eventually there will be eyelashes coming over this eye. But right now, I'm going to pretend that the eyelashes aren't there. And I'll touch in that very pale blue here at the top of the eye. I left this part white, and I'll thin out the color lower. Next, pick up a thicker consistency, just a tiny bit on the brush. And while that's damp, touch it into the top of the eye. And watch how it spreads. It won't spread too far because the eye is just slightly damp. And you can kind of coax the color lower. So I'm seeing a darker blue up here, and a lot of that will eventually be covered by the eyelashes. And down lower, it's a more pale blue. Further into the painting, I'll apply eyelashes and darker markings and shadows. While we worked on the reflection shape, this part of the eye has dried, and we're just about finished. So here's some options. My pupil is appearing to be a very dark brown, and I like that. But if you'd like to take all or part of it even darker, you could touch in straight ultramarine blue, and that will create an even darker brown to a black. I'm touching in ultramarine blue to just parts of the pupil. This is dark brown, which I like. If you'd like to create a smoother transition from the very dark brown into the mid-tone brown, you could return to your gray on the palette and gently touch in just little dots of color. All of this is optional at this point, and you'll want to make decisions based on what you see in your painting. Now I'm using straight burnt umber, and I'm using a thicker consistency, and that creates a darker value. We've got the eyes and the nose and the underpainting in place, the lightest colors that can be seen. And I would love to further refine the eyes right now by creating the eyelashes. I'll use this gray mix of ultramarine blue and burnt umber to create the eyelashes. And I'm adding some water to wake up the color. And I'll begin with a pale application of neutral gray. This is the consistency of thin milk. So first, I'll create the general shape of the eyelashes. There's the upper edge of where the eyelashes will be. Now, as we move further out, I need to begin to create the actual lashes, and I'm using the very tip of the brush to do that. So that's where I'd like those lashes to be. And I'll just give it a couple seconds to dry. Now that we've got the general shape in place, and that's dry, we can begin to go darker. So where I had used thin milk, I'm going a little thicker. This is more like whole milk. What I'd like to see is a darker value up here at the base. And then I'll bring some lashes outward. So I'll take it darker here, just slightly darker. and begin to pull the color. And I'm creating hair-like markings using the very tip of the brush. That went in a little thick, but I think I can make adjustments. I'll make that one a little longer. And this might look sloppy for a while. Now you still can't see much of a difference over the ultramarine blue, but we'll continue to make adjustments. So there we've gone a little darker. And if something did go in too thick, or you don't like something, for example, I don't like what happened right there, I just rinsed my brush, picked up a bit more color, and let's see if I can create, there we go. I just created some longer hairs, and I hope they're not too long. They are looking pretty long, but I'll keep it like that for now. And take a step back. Make sure you like what you see. That's dry, and I'll go in thicker and darker. You might need to bring in some thicker color again. This is like cream, and remix. This is like whole milk to thin cream. Make sure you like it. That's looking good. This thicker consistency will create a darker value. Now right along here, I'll touch in the color. Right along the top edge, very gently. And then begin to pull it outward. I'll go over those lashes that I had just created. If the color's coming off too thick, rinse your brush and wipe it on the towel. Now you see I have not given attention to this area yet, but I will. And now let's see if I can go even darker, and I'm not sure if I can, using a thicker consistency. This application contains a little more brown in the mix, and that often helps to create a darker value when you add more brown to the mix. Now, let's give attention to the highlight shapes, where I'd like to create some reflection markings. Typically, in the reflections, you'll see shadows of the eyelashes and also some dark markings representing what the deer is looking at. Now this photo is not helping me very much. It's so dark. So I'm going to use my imagination. I'll pick up some gray, the consistency of whole milk to thin cream. And maybe down here, I'll just create a curving line or a couple curving lines, dots of color. And I encourage you to use your imagination. Now coming out from up here, I'm going to pick up a gray that leans towards brown. Again, the consistency of whole milk to thin cream. And let's get some eyelashes in place. And the reason I'm using a gray that leans towards brown is because of that blue that we've got underneath. I think I'll take it just a little darker, right along the upper edge, and pull some hairs. So you can still see some blue peeking out, but you can also see bits of eyelashes. I'm touching in some burnt umber, just a tiny bit. And soften I thought I just wanted to create a smoother transition between the highlight shape and the iris. And when it's dry, I'll decide if I like it, and if I don't like it, I'll lift out some color. So now we've got the eyelashes in place, and that is adding a lot of character to our deer.
I hope you found this demonstration enjoyable and helpful. And if you'd like to learn more, I invite you to come on over to our online school. Thanks so much for watching.